Hello, and I want to welcome you to a discussion on other types of equations. So let's get started. Okay, so polynomial equations. The equation is in a general form if one side is equal to 0 and the polynomial on the other side is in descending powers of the variables. That means that variables are going to have exponents from largest to smallest. The degree of a polynomial equation is the same as the highest degree of any term in the equation. So, for example, in number 1, we'd say the degree for that equation, 3x to the fourth minus 27x squared equals 0, the degree would be 4 because the highest exponent to a variable is 4, meaning the degree is 4 for that polynomial equation. For 2, 4x to the third minus 8x squared minus 16x plus 32 equals 0, the degree for that would be 3 because 3 is the highest variable to a power. Okay, so these examples say to solve the following polynomial equations by factoring. So for factoring, with number 1, that was 3x to the fourth minus 27x squared equals 0. Now, if we look at number 3, the 3 and the 27, those are the coefficients of the variables with exponents. And if you notice, 3 will go into both 3 and 27, so that is the number that you can pull out. Now, if we look at the variable, when we look for factoring out a variable, you take the least exponent that is present, which we have 2 and we have 4 and 2. 2 is the least, so that will be what we factor out. So we're going to factor out a 3x squared. So it's essentially kind of like dividing. For this first term, 3x to the fourth, we're going to say how many times will 3x squared go into that. So it's essentially like saying 3x to the fourth divided by 3x squared, leaving you with just x squared. Okay, and finally, we have the next term, minus 27x squared. If you say to yourself, a negative 27x squared divided by 3x squared, you're just going to be left with a negative 9. Because the x squares cancel out, and 27 divided by 3 is 9, maintaining the negative in the problem. And remember, all that's going to equal 0 since we're dealing with polynomial equations. Okay, since we now have two parts equaling 0, we can set each part that's been factored equal to 0 and solve for the variables. So we have 3x squared equals 0, and what's in parentheses here, x squared minus 9 equals 0. Solving for x in this first one, you want to divide 3 on both sides. So it's going to leave you with x squared equals 0 over 3, or just 0. Now to get the x by itself, which is being squared, you take the square root. It's going to leave you with just x equals 0. Notice that if it was any other number, you would want to have the plus or minus, but since 0 has neither sign, it is just plain 0. Now for x squared minus 9 equals 0, you want to start by adding 9 on both sides of the equation. When you do that, you have x squared equals 0 plus 9, or that x squared is just equal to 9. Now x is being squared, so do the inverse operation of doing a square root on both sides. That's referred to as the square root property. So the x squared and square root cancel out, leaving you with just x. Remember, when you take a square root of anything, you're left with plus or minus. And the square root of 9 is going to yield plus or minus 3. So for this equation, you have 3 answers. You have 0, negative 3, and positive 3. Okay, now if we look at number 2, we're going to need to factor. And the key to doing this type of factoring is to break the equation into two pieces. What that essentially means is that right here, the green line is where we're breaking it into two pieces. And you'll see in just a second what that means. So for these first two terms, 4x to the third minus 8x squared, you want to find a term that will go into both. If you look, the number that would go into both 4 and 8, that would be 4. Okay, and now to choose a variable with an exponent, you choose the least of the two. 3 and 2, you're going to go with 2 because it is the least. Now, using your ability to factor out of 4x squared from this, you can say 4x to the third divided by 4x squared, and when you do that, you're just going to be left with a plain x. Okay, over here you're going to have a negative 8x squared, and you can say that's divided by 4x squared. When you do that, you're just going to be left with a negative 2, because negative 8 divided by 4 is a negative 2, and the x squares cancel. Okay, now we want to look at the second piece, negative 16x plus 32. If you choose a number that both 16 and 32 will go into, you can pull out a negative 16. And when you do that, you can say negative 16x divided by negative 16 will just leave you with the plain x. And inside, a negative 16 will go into 32 a negative 2 times. Retaining the negative sign here allows you to have the positive sign when distributing across the negative. Equals 0. And as you might have learned from a previous math class, when these two terms are similar, you can break it into the two pieces are on the outside coming together as one term, so 4x squared minus 16 being one term, and x minus 2 being the other term. Since this has been factored and it's set equal to 0, you can now set each term equal to 0. So 4x squared minus 16 equals 0, and then we have x minus 2, and let's set that to equal 0 as well. Solving this first equation, 4x squared minus 16 equals 0, let's start by adding 16 to both sides of the equation. When we do that, we get 4x squared equals 16. To get x further by itself, we divide by 4 on both sides. You're going to be left with x squared equals 16 divided by 4 is 4. Now to do the square root property, to eliminate the square, we have x equals the square root of 4, which will just yield a plus or minus 2 for that solution. Now for this other equation, x minus 2 equals 0, just simply add 2 to both sides, and you're just going to be left with x equals 2. And if you notice, we have 2 in both cases, so in this case we're just going to have two solutions of x equals positive 2 and x equals minus 2. Okay, and for the final portion of this section, we have absolute value equations. So for this type, we note that an absolute value denotes how many spaces there are possible away from 0, meaning it could be in a positive direction or a negative direction units away. So with number 1, the absolute value of x equals 7. What that means is that x could equal positive 7 places from 0, or it is possible that x could equal negative 7 places from 0. So those are the two answers. You will most likely get two answers from absolute value equations. Okay, with number 2, the absolute value of x plus 3 will equal 6. So what you simply do is break it into x plus 3 equals, you take the possible negative being equal 6, and you take the possible positive direction being just the positive 6. And then you solve for the variable. For this first one, just subtract 3 on both sides. So when you do that, you have x equals negative 6 minus 3, or just x equals a negative 9. Okay, on the other hand, x plus 3 equals 6, you just subtract 3 on both sides. And when you accomplish that, you have x equals 6 minus 3, or x is just equal to a positive 3. Okay, with number 3, we have the absolute value of 3x plus 5 as a quantity, plus 11 equals 10. To start this, you just subtract 11 on both sides. So you have the square root of 3x plus 5 equals 10 minus 11, or just negative 1. Now the important thing to note here is that this will have no solution for one fact. And as you may guess, It is because of the negative. The negative keeps us from having a solution, because absolute value is the difference between the distance from 0 and cannot be negative. It can only represent a positive number. So that negative tells us no solution. Okay, with number 4, 2 times the quantity of absolute value x plus 3 as a quantity equals 14. To solve this problem first, you want to divide the absolute value portion by 2, leaving you just the absolute value of x plus 3 equals 14 divided by 2, or just 7. Now, just as before, you can break it into its even pieces of x plus 3 equals the possible negative 7, or x plus 3 equals the positive 7. Now just solve for the variable by subtracting 3. So we have x equals negative 7 minus 3, or just minus 10, as one solution. The other solution over here, we have to subtract 3. When we do that, we have x equals 7 minus 3, or just a positive 4.